Welcome, everybody, back to our third session today, exploring all things culinary cannabis and cannabis beverages and foods and how to pair cannabis and foods. This is something that we're going to explore a little bit today. Joyce Cenali from Sonoma Hills Farm is here with me. Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you, Rachel, and California State Fair Cannabis Awards for having us.
This is a really exciting time to be in cannabis. Joyce has been fighting the good fight, as they say, for a long time, and I think it's really exciting to see all of this come to fruition. So thank you for all of your hard work as an advocate for this industry and community, Joyce.
Thank you. Back at you.
All right. So let's dive into two of my favorite topics, wine and weed. These are topics that I think a lot of people don't understand actually have quite a few similarities between them. So, what does that mean? Whether we're talking terroir, which is a term that maybe some of you have heard in the wine world. Appellations of origin is something we're also going to explore. And then some cultivation techniques. So these are three broad ways in which these products are more similar than they are not. So let's start with terroir. Joyce, do you want to go ahead and take a stab at defining that?
Absolutely. So terroir is going to be the biological and sort of scientific basis for what the soil and the surrounding climate sort of does to inform in our case, flower, but in the case of wine, the grapes, and how they get their deepness of color, or their acidity or their sweetness. And so essentially terroir is going to be sort of regionally adapted to various different elements. Obviously, it starts with the soil, how that soil is composed. In our case, we're in an area that has sandy loam, which has a lot of limestone in it. Every mountain range we see around California used to be a volcano. Volcanoes can be very fertile after several decades of degradation after the volcano happens. So there's all sorts of elements that make up the soil. And then you have the overall climate, seasonality, how much moisture there is in the air, how close it may be to a water source, how that water source sort of blends into the soil composition, if it's coming from above or below. And then ultimately you have things like wind. And, unfortunately now we're starting to step into climate change issues. So how much heat. So all of these things kind of play into how terroirs are defined, which is really kind of going to be the baseline that's like married to, the physical kind of location of the place.
That's a really good definition. Thank you, Joyce. I think in wine, what we hear a lot is a sense of place. That's kind of more broadly how we can look at terroir. This is the way that a highly trained sommelier might be able to blind taste a wine from a specific region, and based on some of the factors of sweetness or minerality or acidity or whatever they're looking at, they might be able to identify where that wine came from based on the expression of terroir that's in the glass. And we definitely do see that also in flower. So terroir becomes one of those pillars of understanding wine, but we can absolutely apply that to cannabis. And as Joyce was mentioning, understanding the placeness of it, that translates into appellations of origin. So in wine, an appellation is a protected, designated area. Wineries in those areas have to go through a very rigorous, years-long process to get those appellations designated, and basically what that means is that it's protected. So champagnes have to be from the Champagne region of France. So it gives not only that sense of place from the terroir, but a quality assurance for the consumer who's going to understand that a Napa Cab means you're getting a really high quality Napa Cabernet Sauvignon. So the appellations piece kind of takes that terroir and brings it to the regulatory level, and that's something we're also seeing in cannabis. And that's really exciting to begin to see people like the Mendocino Appellations Project and all of these various initiatives where local growers are coming together and are identifying the key pieces of terroir that make their flower really unique and really special. So that's a really exciting thing and way in which we're seeing those two worlds cross over. Have you done any work on the appellation designation side?
We've done preliminary work. The wine comparison, there's the American Vintners Association, the AVA, and there are several hundred designated appellations in wine. Our land happens to fall in the most recent AVA called the Petaluma Gap. Our legacy group, we came together. We had been working in different parts of the state, but we aligned on Sonoma as a great place to grow cannabis, and so we bought a property, and about a year later, poof, it's now a part of this new AVA called the Petaluma Gap, which is interesting because we actually are about 3 miles away from the closest vineyard. Vineyards also have, more allowance for sprays than cannabis does. So being near a winery or a vineyard isn't always a good thing in cannabis. Just want to point that out. But relative to the AVAs, California put forward a program. So California took the lead on appellations, and it took the lead on organic certification. So we have a program called OCal, which is described right here, and they had a table a few weeks ago. It's the largest certification arm for organics in the country, actually, and they're about to have their 50th anniversary. But they came up with a program specifically for cannabis. In addition to that, sort of the same time that the governor and the DCC forwarded this, they also forwarded an appellations program for cannabis. So it's the very first in the country that allows for a designation similar to wine. So to the question, are we on the path? We are on the path. However, there are a couple of looming things. The first is you have to have to be awarded an AVA, it does require diplomacy and sort of community engagement. So in the wine industry, you have many multiple vineyards next to each other, and it really benefits them if they say, get an AVA, Dry Creek, Carneros, the Russian River. Like there's just a few regions that are extremely well known where you get that designation, it starts to be a talking point for your distributors and sales channels all over the country, all over the world. People start to, to your point on Napa Cabs, understand there's a similarity from where that comes from. In cannabis, we don't really have an AVA group that's sort of helping with this. So it's individual farms and their advocates that have to come together to do it. And then in terms of how the, sort of structure was forwarded by the state, you have to have at least 3, groups, farms in a given area that can define a scientific similarity. So maybe that's, we have X amount of X nutrient just naturally available in our soil. We get the same wind patterns. We are, in some way aligned scientifically. So that is a very big, study to do. And to put that on the backs of individual operators that are in this nascent industry is, it's a huge, hill to climb. So we will be getting...
it's a financial cost.
Yeah.
It's extremely expensive to
definitely
undergo all
6
that.
figures, for sure. So we're going to be on that path. I'm happy to say that there are now a couple other growers in our region that I think we have similarities scientifically with that are game to kind of forward this discussion, but it's going to be a 5 to 10 year process for us specifically.
And it's going to be interesting to watch that as it continues to expand to all of the regions for cannabis. I think Humboldt is a great example of a region that's become almost synonymous with high quality, sun-grown and farmer-driven cannabis cultivation for a long time. So how can Humboldt broadly, but then even those sub-AVAs really begin to identify themselves, and how that can then be used as a marketing tool? Because as you mentioned, we've seen already the power of that within the wine industry, and how that's a real vehicle to driving sales. And we need that more than ever in this industry.
We do, and I think, when I use the term legacy, I use it in a couple of different ways, but I think moving forward, the fact that Humboldt has so many growers that they're not monocropping cannabis. Many of them are growing lots of other things. They've already interacted, with the CCOF or other, organic certifiers, and there are overlaps on the Appalachian side in some ways, but notably, they have a sense of history for their project, and hopefully they've been collecting data on it. Whereas a lot of the newer, operators, either they're not navigating in a, place that would be applicable to an appellation, or they're going to play a lot of catch up. So I think it's one of those potential areas of stickiness, and where Humboldt and certain regions will have a little bit of a frontline, entry point, which will be helpful, and hopefully with the education that we can forward to the consumers, that will start to have some impact in the retail environment.
Absolutely. So our last note here in terms of some broad similarities is on cultivation techniques between cannabis and wine. This is something that's really interesting because they're both agricultural products of the earth, and there are some really similar ways in which these can both be cultivated, but there's also some ways in which they're notably different. I'm going to start with the differences because I think this is something that's a little bit under discussed, because comparing wine and weed has been popular for a while now as this industry has gotten its legs. But there is a key difference in that when you're growing grapes and you're working with vines that are established and have been planted for years, decades, centuries, ancient vines are actually a thing. Cannabis is an annual plant. It is chopped down every year. So it has the effects of terroir, but you do need to really build up the soil every year, and you need to put that effort back in and kind of start from scratch a little bit every year. And I think that that's one of the biggest key cultivation things that needs to be addressed, and as a dissimilarity between these two categories. But that said, there's a lot of other similarities in terms of cultivation. Not only are they on the same timeline, harvest is harvest in both wine country and weed country. Everything's kind of coming down around the same time. You will see vintners who are, maybe pulling certain varieties a little bit earlier, and you'll see some cannabis cultivators who will crop some really heavy colas before they start developing mold and some undesirable attributes. So there's a lot of similarities there. Dry farming, I think that's one of my favorite things to kind of shine a light on, because it's such a unique cultivation technique in both of these categories. And in wine, dry farming, they're literally not adding water to the cultivation. The plants are getting all of the moisture from the earth. So when cannabis is doing that, it's the same thing. In wine, that's really resulting in a very concentrated flavor. And I think it's a similar effect with cannabinoids. I don't know if I've seen any lab tests to support that. I don't know, maybe you've seen some dry farming results. I'd be interested. Well, I've got to talk to the Eel River folks.
Yeah, on the data side, you see a high presence of terpenes more so, and possibly cannabinoids, but I think that's going to affect the flavonoids, the terpenes, and whatnot. But what you will see is an increase there. The data may also show slightly less volume, but the volume and the sort of look of the bud is, I will use the word, more concentrated.
She's thirsty. She's a little dehydrated.
Yeah.
Because she's working really hard. And actually in wine, slight amounts of stress on the vines do improve the quality of the overall finished product. And I would venture that as we get some more data to support this in cannabis, we may find similar things there as well.
Yeah, we absolutely will, and that's going to be part of, the Appalachian study that we start to step into. Yeah, and just another point on kind of cultivation techniques that. In terms of utilization of team, when you think about certain regions and, from a industrial perspective of how we forward this, I think that monocropping is not ideal. And if we want to weave a cash crop into, an existing industry where there's applications that make sense. Wine and cannabis have a lot of, really strong overlaps. So ultimately, I think that, it's really good for thinking towards more organic, food processes that aren't just stripping the land.
For sure. Yeah. And I guess this may go without saying, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't shine a light on this, that in terms of cultivation techniques and kind of all of the things we're talking about here, it's really specific to sun-grown cannabis. You're not going to get terroir from an indoor cultivation in downtown LA. Like, there's no downtown LA ingrown terroir.
Yeah. But meanwhile, it's probably easier to grow indoors in some of the environments where you would be growing outdoors because the climate is set for it. To grow indoors in certain parts, especially with this weather that we're experiencing, it's 100 degrees outside in Sacramento, and there's indoor facilities all around us. And I'm not trying to say that there's, anything wrong with those people doing that, but think forward 10, 15, 20 years, if it's 120 and 130, HVAC requirements and the environmental standards, so doing stuff where you can grow outdoors, indoors, and from a mixed light perspective, generally is going to be environmentally better because you're not going to have the peaks and valleys that you have in some of these other climates.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have a more controlled environment, but if we're talking 10 years from now when perhaps federal legalization has already happened, does that mean, if we've been able to establish appellations of origin for California cannabis, for example, and we can ship across state lines, does it make sense for an indoor cultivation in Ohio to be growing year-round when they could get sun-grown cannabis from California shipped to them, sold in local dispensaries at a much more sustainable cultivation style and technique?
Yeah. I really hope we get to a place that instead of talking about safety and what's good for people, given that over 50% of the population at some point consumes cannabis, we start talking about consumer choice and conscious shopping effect as the main talking point in Washington, because to your point, there's really bad weed being grown in a lot of other parts of the country, and it's basically just setting consumers up to understand they don't deserve the best.
Well, and imagine this was wine. If Ohio couldn't get wine from California and they were like, okay, well, we'll just grow some grapes inside, and don't worry, guys, we got this. That's some bad grape juice.
Seriously. Yeah. Massachusetts is a mostly outdoor market. I lived there for 4 years, went to college there. It's hella humid. This year, the weed from there, it's swampy wet. It's going to be gross, and it's all going to have to go to, extract basically. So
right.
I feel sorry for people that only have that option.
That's right. So that's why some places indoor cultivation is not only the best, it's the only option for a lot of those cultivators. All right. So we've already heard a little bit about what you've been up to at Sonoma Hills Farm and what's happening in the Petaluma Gap. So you're positioned just outside of Petaluma. You're a couple miles from Tamales Bay. How far are you?
Yeah, so we're actually 9 miles from Dillon Beach, from the ocean. But yeah, we're going to be in the Tamales bodega. Those are keywords that people would recognize. Bodega being where the Birds was filmed. So we do get a lot of wind, and that's kind of one of the main features. The sandy loam soil composition. There are certain wineries, like Iron Horse is one of my favorite wineries. It's in Sebastopol area. It's actually a carve out of the Russian River. I forget what their appellation is called, but it's an appellation within an appellation because of their sandy loam composition. So we actually have a lot of notes for certain wineries around the Sebastopol area in terms of our soil composition. It's rolling hills. There's not a ton of trees. There are little pockets of eucalyptus, no redwoods in the direct view. And so we haven't had any fire issues. Relative to the water, we have a well. We have really good water production. This rain season was fantastic, but even in advance of that, there was a stream bed underneath the land. So we sort of, it checked a lot of the boxes. It's also, there's no sprayed stuff around us. It's just dairy land for forever. So cows, it was previously a chicken farm. So the only sort of frictional elements that presents is dust We don't necessarily worry too much about what sort of heavy metals go into our feeds for our animals to the extent that cannabis does. So that's the only issue that we may have, is if our neighbor is feeding their cow something that, then eventually he poops, and then she or he poops, and then it busts up into dust and blows over to us. But aside from that, there's no sprayed pesticide, stuff anywhere around us. And the wind, to go back to that, is a really important element. And I think this is really relevant to certain, you'll see certain AVA notes on the wine side where if they're in a really windy area, they're going to have certain more prevalent, sort of chemical reads. For us, it definitely plays into the oil production. So not just, cannabinoids, also the terpene output, which you can either have an entourage in a full spectrum product, or you can isolate, each of the different, byproducts that come out of it. So we see really strong oil production because the stalks are trying to stay.
They're stressed. It's the similar thing to the vine.
Yeah.
The wind moves these. They have to be stronger, and it forces the trichomes to produce a little more resin. Is that what you're...
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. And you guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Petaluma Gap also has sort of a maritime influence with some low-hanging clouds and fog?
Yes. Yeah, so there's definitely the fog element. Yeah.
And in wine, that's something that's really helpful as it gets hotter, because it keeps things from getting too hot and too scorched. I imagine it's similar with
It is, and it can be a little bit of a detriment in the flowering stage, but it's fantastic in the harvest stage. Just like wine, we're looking to harvest before the sun comes up, ideally before she's even peeking her head. That gets a little logistically awkward. To have people there from 3 to 7 in the morning is hard, but that's the ideal situation. When the flower is really doing its thing in late August into September, you want sun. You just want sun. But yeah.
Well, because then at that point you might be dealing with some mold and moisture issues with the bud as it gets really big and heavy. And so if you have that low-hanging fog, you've got a little breeding ground for some contamination you don't want.
Exactly.
Got it. All right. So now that we've kind of walked through some of the similarities in terms of cultivation and how these beautiful products come to our table, once they get there, this is where things get really exciting, I know, for both of us, because we're both such fans of flavor and exploring how cannabis can be presented alongside food and beverage and hospitality, and that's something that you guys have done such a beautiful job of building out. We didn't get to shout out Aaron on the last slide. Do you want to tell us a little bit about Aaron?
Yeah, so our farmer, once we got our license, we had been friendly with Aaron Kiefer. He is the lead, he was the lead cultivator for the French Laundry for 10 years, but he's been growing cannabis since he was a young man. I won't say how young. But one thing about him, he had mostly scaled his cannabis activities in an indoor environment. So he had grown outdoors, but not at this scale, whereas I had and our other partner had. So it has been a shift for him. And I think even in his mind, he was dealing with, ultimately, indoor definitely puts forward the more, sort of pretty orientation, but it also, sort of strips away a lot of the other. If we're thinking of cannabis as a wellness product, we kind of need all of the elements of it to extend into ourselves, into our bodies. And so I think now he's, the aromas and just the diversity and really the beauty and how the plant speaks to you in its natural format is so much more profound than in an indoor environment. It's really if we talk about freedom, you want a free plant, they're going to be an outdoor plant.
Well, I know Aaron has done such a beautiful job of taking his culinary approach to your flower. And one of the ways in which wine and weed and food really are all similar is through the language of terpenes. So terpenes, for those of you who don't know, are aromatic molecules that are responsible for flavor, aroma, and effect in cannabis, but also in a wide variety of botanicals and other plants, lemons, mint, rosemary. You guys are using terpenes and eating terpenes all day long. And terpenes, of course, are also an important part of balancing and blending wines. Winemakers talk about terpenes all the time. And in cannabis, it's a huge driver in terms of the flavor and also the effect. So what I have up here is a combination of a traditional flavor wheel where you can understand how you can match flavors across that wheel. So you're either going to pair like and like flavors, or you're going to match contrasting flavors. But this flavor wheel is actually a terpene flavor wheel. You can't see it very well, but it does go through the 5 key terpenes in cannabis and offer a little bit of a breakdown. So looking at those flavors and understanding generally those buckets, we've got citrus, we've got herbaceous, we've got spicy, we've got tropical, heady, mango-y, myrcene. There's gas, super gassy. So those flavors that are the drivers of what you're going to taste when you have a food or taste cannabis are also going to impact the effect. They're going to make you feel something. Yeah. So as we're looking at terpenes and we're thinking about pairing terpenes, we're going to want to talk about the actual pairing of flavors, but you also want to consider the vibe. What's the vibe of this dish? What's the vibe of this drink? An old fashioned is different than a pina colada, you know, and that's partially due to the terpenes.
Yeah. Yeah, and if we think back to, in the comparison between wine and weed, wine, is last 50 years, the country has gotten really behind that as one of the predominant ingestions of alcohol. But back in the Prohibition days, folks wanted to drink, and they were making Everclear, and they were making the strongest stuff that they possibly could because you needed to do it in a concentrated format because you might get in trouble. And now here we are 100 years later, and you don't walk into Total Wine or Bevmo and say maybe a few people are going in and saying, I want your 80 proof plus. But more often, they're going in and saying, I am making X, Y, and Z meal. I'm having X, Y, and Z party. I am looking for X, Y, and Z experience. And the notes and the flavors are a lot more prevalent in the sort of, buying practice in that traditional retail environment. So here we are in cannabis, a few years into our journey on the legal side. We had a retail environment that was a medical environment where folks were going in asking questions about their ailments because they were kind of forced to by the law. So some of those ailments may have been placebo or bullshit, or not real, excuse me. But the majority of them, hopefully, were looking for some sort of, suggestion on a medicinal wellness perspective. We completely blew that up with Prop 64, and in 2018, everything shifted. And all of a sudden, the conversation became, how much potency can I get out of this thing? And, I do all of our in-stores, and I would say half of the customers that we talk to are not looking for that. They are looking for more of an experience based on a symptom or, to your point and discussion, just having a distilled or an isolated function of THC is not going to get you the wellness result that you're looking for if you have muscle aches, or you're looking to go to sleep, or you're looking for anti-anxiety. It's all the other surrounding things, which actually then plays into flavor because, by the way, some of the terpenes that are helpful in that respect, or that would be accoladed in that respect, speak to the flavor and the pairing profile. So, we talk about these pairings and events and experiences, but at the end of the day, that's a really heady, and hopefully a lot of people can access that, and I really hope that. But I think in the retail experience, we need a little bit more, similarities to what we do in the sort of alcohol shopping algorithm.
Yeah, it's about the sensory experience of it all. It's not just give me your most potent product that you can get. And it's challenging in the retail-only environment. Imagine that we live in a world where the only place you can get wine or beer is at a liquor store. You can't go to a restaurant, you can't sit down and ask a bartender questions, you can't have a sommelier there to really walk you through things. So I know that I've worked to create a lot of experiences that do create that. I know you guys are doing an amazing job of this. And I think that when it comes to bringing cannabis and food and putting them alongside each other as a pairing, using the same lexicon and tools that we do in wine is such an effective way to do that. So I'll give an example. One of the ways that I love to do this is start by, you have to actually teach people how to taste cannabis. Yeah. People don't know. Like, I would love if anyone would raise your hand if you know how to taste cannabis. So one of the things that I like to do is walk people through a 3-step tasting method, and this is something that you guys could absolutely begin to do as you taste new flower, as you're learning about cannabis. It's a really simple thing. I think people understand that when you taste wine, everyone has seen somebody swirling a glass and then sticking their nose in it, right? So for cannabis, it's not that dissimilar. My basic 3-step tasting method would be to first nose your jar. You're gonna stick your nose in there. You're gonna stick your nose in the tube, and that first whiff brings all of those terpenes directly to you. So you know, okay, this is really citrusy. Wow, this has a really spicy, peppery profile. And then to be able to take it a step further, if you're working with a joint or like extremely, extremely clean pipe or bong, you can do the second step. So you put the joint to your mouth. It's called a dry pull or a terpene pull. And without lighting it, you inhale through the joint. You're going to bring those terpenes directly onto your palate. So you're able to go from citrusy to, oh, wow, this is key lime. Oh, my gosh, there's a little bit of undercurrent of white flower. Really take this step. This is something that I've seen people do this for the first time and they go, oh my God, because nobody does this step. This is a really important one that'll help you understand what this flower actually tastes like and begin to explore strains and terpenes and understand what you like and what works for you. And then the third step is to actually light it. This is obviously the fun one. But in that step, similarly to as you're tasting wine, you begin to evaluate the body of the smoke. You'll see, is it white smoke? Is it black smoke? How thick is it? How heavy is it? Does it just hang really low in the room or does it immediately blush off? So like all of those various things are gonna offer you a different smoking experience, and it's all part of the overall tasting experience. So if you're gonna pair things, you have to know how to taste them first.
Very cool. I cannot wait to sit down and do that with you post-COVID. I think it's been a minute.
Let's do it.
I think I would add to that also is on the extraction side, and you know, extraction can be an isolation process and then a reintroduction of everything you've isolated. There are ways to do it, however, where you're just, you know, sort of bottling up the plant as a whole. But what we found, so we have a beverage partner now named Maison Bloom, where they're taking full spectrum oil and making flavor profiles of drinks around it. The cannabis itself, so we have a strain called Cherry Cheesecake, and by the way, it is so indicative when you see a plant named banana something or orange something or guava something, like
it's a hint. It's
crazy relevant to how it smells in the field. So it's a cherry cheesecake, and there's like within the beverage they have a strawberry Provençal, I think is the overall beverage that it's in. And you get this cheesy, kind of like smoky, cheesy effect, and that comes from the cannabis, whereas when you smoke it, you don't necessarily have that cheese effect. So it's really interesting how these things play out into the end product, whether that's an edible or, you know, a beverage, whatnot.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad you brought that up because cannabis extracts are such pure expressions of flavors, as live resin, rosin, things where you're flash freezing the plant at its most peak terpene and cannabinoid profile and able to then extract all of that and put it into a different form factor. It's not quite like wine and weed. It's a little bit more like weed and spirits. And if you think about distillate is really a fairly tasteless, neutral, cannabinoid only sort of product. And that's really similar to the distillation process that spirits go through where you're extracting all this stuff. So if you take a spirit and you distill it, you're left with something that's really neutral. And then if you want to turn that into a gin, you add a bunch of botanicals to it. Botanicals are basically terpenes. They're taking the terpenes from juniper, from rosemary, from all of these plants, lemon, and they're putting that into a neutral spirit to turn that into a vodka. Similarly, with distillate, we do see people who are using that, and then they're adding terpenes back into it after they've stripped them out. They take all the terpenes out, and then they're like, oh, we're going to put some more back in. So that's a really interesting similarity there too.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to explore with this plant, and as much as I want to, I'm a flower smoker, and it's going to be important for us to continue the forwarding of the flower, but I do think that there's a lot of new parties, new demographics that are going to be more open to, some of the edibles and some of the beverages and whatnot. And it's fantastic that we have so much diversity of application to be able to cater to so many different people. And topicals, the gateway product.
The gateway. Well, I think beverages are actually the gateway, but topicals are a good one too. But, so we kind of know all of these various products, but in terms of pairing, this is something that I really enjoy doing. Again, as I was saying, you can match like-to-like flavors, opposite flavors. How do you approach pairing cannabis flower and food, or maybe cannabis and wine?
Yeah, so, we think of ourselves as the third leg of hospitality. When I say ourselves, we think that cannabis and those of us that grow it in native soil are, building a product that is the third leg of hospitality. We have food, we have beverage, and cannabis hasn't gotten her accolade as such, but that's essentially what she is for most, chefs that are talking to their provider, for things that they're putting on their menus. They have such a sense of, flavor and where it comes from and origin. They're probably also cannabis consumers. So for us, it's talking to chefs and working with them to understand, from a seasonality effect, what they're most interested in putting on their menus. And yes, there are similarities every year. We don't necessarily have a brand new version of, an orange coming out every year, but it's just, what notes are you choosing to put on your menu seasonally, and how can we think about choosing flavor profiles on the, flower selection side that maybe will, have elements that would fit in community with what they're putting on their menus. And then working with them at harvest time to basically, further analyze that in terms of actually utilizing, consuming together. And then, certain elements come in terms of the extraction process, like how prevalent are certain terpenes, how applicable will they be in the end food product. So it's a long-term, kind of journey. I would say with any chef, the starting point may be flower, but the hope would be to get to something, like a beverage or an edible, and that's probably a 3-year journey with them.
Right. Yeah, and as you know, I've explored a lot of pairings with my company, Altered Plates, and my brother, Chef Holden Jagger, who's a cannabis chef and a cultivator. One of the things he always really likes to do when he's talking about pairings is sometimes we'll walk them through that 3-step tasting method, and then sometimes he'll have people maybe do the first 2 steps before they eat a course, and then the joint is kind of a digestif for after they've eaten that dish. So there's not only the flavor element to consider when we're talking about pairings, but also that experiential piece and how and when you want to feel a certain way. Yeah. And that's similar to how we would course out a meal. You're going to start with a light style wine. You're not going to start with a heavy, really tannic cab, So we have to take that same thoughtful approach to understanding, okay, well, not only is this a light citrusy thing, it's going to be not sedating. You're not going to be asleep after the first course. Yeah. That's an important factor to consider.
Yeah, and we definitely think about what is the overall dosing of the event going to be. To your point, we're definitely weaving in, on the front end, it's going to be more of an uplifting, let's get social. And then, towards the entree, maybe you're starting to want to feel a little balanced. And then towards the end, in some paths, you may be wanting to go, all right, I'm ready for that sleep journey. But in other paths, you may be ready for, this is my nightcap, and I'm ready to keep the night going. So kind of, playing on the notes of that in terms of how the flavor is defined and the overall experience and the time of day and the time of year. And then also we, from an infusion perspective, there are a lot of series where it's the plate that you receive has X amount of cannabinoids in it, or the milligram content. We're trying to give people the option to light to strong, so the pairing aspect of it, a la the wine industry, you're not, when you sit down for a tasting, they're not like, you have to drink that entire sipping that I gave you. You can pour it out and, kind of keep going to sort of attenuate yourself, to the experience. So I think that's also an important layer, particularly given that a lot of folks that want to experience this maybe aren't heavy users.
And that's a really important piece, because also you have a lot more control. If you are presented a joint and you understand that you can take one puff and then put it down and you don't have to not eat because the food is infused. We used to do infused dinners, and I would drop a course in front of somebody and they would be like, what part's infused? And I'd tell them, and then I would go get their plate, and they ate around that part because they didn't want to get more high. So when you're working with a flower pairing, you can still enjoy that pairing without necessarily going that far. And we even did pairing events with pregnant people who would not consume, but they would do the first 2 steps of that pairing process so that they could still enjoy it and still understand the actual flavor components of that. And I think that that's really a great way to bring people in. And that's what hospitality is about with cannabis, and that's what hospitality is about with wine. But to connect those 2 things at the table is really special.
Yeah, it's to your point on service. A lot of the folks, we just did an event at the Claremont Hotel in Oakland, and very high-end Michelin rated experience, very focused on service. And the folks there and their sort of knowledge of this plant was so much higher than most bud tenders that I interact with.
Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite things. So I'm here with the Clever Root, www.thecleverroot.com. Please go scan my banner. But the Clever Root was originally launched in 2015 as a print publication that brought wine and spirits and hospitality and food together. And I came from the wine and spirits industry. And when I started going around talking to chefs, talking to mixologists, talking to somms, and telling them what I was doing, I couldn't believe how almost every person in hospitality was like, oh, well, let me tell you about this weed wine I've been making in my bathtub for 3 years. And then I just recently judged the High Spirits Awards, which was the first cannabis beverage specific competition, and which brought judges in from traditional beverage, from all over the country. And so as I was talking to these beverage judges, telling them about what I do, they're like, oh, well, I've been doing this, and let me tell you about my mushrooms. The hospitality industry loves this category, and they're already, to Joyce's point, they already know a lot about this because they understand flavor, they understand ingredients, and cannabis is just another flavor and another ingredient.
Exactly. So dispensaries out there, food and beverage, those parties may be the ones to buy instead of the 25-year-old that knows the price of distillate at the moment.
It's true. This is a subsection of people who actually care. If you care about the food that you're putting on your table and on your plate, you're going to also care about the cannabis you're putting next to it. So high quality, organic, wanting to know about how it is cultivated instead of just buying whatever. Those are things that folks who are interested in hospitality and interested in culinary applications of cannabis are going to be really excited by.
I hope so.
I hope so too.
Yeah, I think they are.
I think we're getting there. Well, I think that's our time, but I don't know if anyone has any questions or if there's anything we didn't mention.
I just wanted to mention this is really cool, the California State Fair having a cannabis division, and relative to what this fair and otherwise can forward is really interesting because we are here amongst all this other produce, and yet we're in a market. Sacramento isn't particularly receptive to sun-grown, to organic, and I feel like we need to have an impasse in this part of the state and other parts of the state outside of, just Northern California, like the San Francisco Bay and LA. So we would like to welcome Sacramento to the sun-grown conversation if Sacramento wants to come on it.
Well, in Los Angeles, where I am too, we want everybody.
Y'all need some help too.
yeah. It's a really exciting time to be sharing this message because it's the most important time for us to continue to beat this drum as this industry is so challenging. But there's so much opportunity here. There's so much to explore in food and cannabis and drinks and bringing all of those things together. So continue to learn and taste and try and tasting. That's it. It's all about taste, taste, taste. That's how you're going to train your palate. That's how you're going to learn about food. That's how you're going to learn about wine. And it's how you're going to learn about cannabis.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you, Joyce.
All the good work you're doing.
Thank you.